when you're ready.
Okay, hi everyone. Mr. Butler's in Birmingham, I'm in Blackpool, and we're going to give you a little bit more detail now, kind of on the news analysis which we've sort of set you. You've obviously got 3 bulletins to look at, and these will cover all the kind of the criteria of the brief, although you will need to make comparisons to news bulletins on each format kind of as you go across. So we'll do that kind of as we go through. We're trying to answer a lot of the stuff which is on the guide sheet. We might not necessarily do it in order, so we'll talk about our thoughts as we kind of go across.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, we hope that you've watched the episode of Newsround that we put on the classroom, but also probably quite good to watch an episode of Newsround where the coronavirus wasn't a thing, so you can see it more on a sort of on a standard day as well, just to get a feel for that. All right. So Mr. Butler's there.
Yeah. Hello guys. I hope you're keeping well and you're following the rules and everything like that. In terms of social distancing, we're going to start to talk through Newsround, and what we'll do is we'll just go through the guide sheet box by box, as though you were in class. That's normally how we'll do it. I think Mr. Underwood is more of the expert on news in comparison to me, so I'll kind of act out the student role. I'll be like offering what I think on some of this stuff. He'll be offering what he thinks, and kind of just going through it bit by bit. Should we start off? Should we go through it?
Yeah, so in some ways, I think we can give you the answers to this first question. In terms of the news format, well, obviously, it is a TV. We were watching it on a TV programme. Newsround has traditionally been a TV show. A little bit of history about Newsround. It started, and you might just Google the actual date, but I think it's coming up to its 50th anniversary. It's just had its 50th anniversary. It used to be at 5 o'clock every day on BBC One, part of Children's BBC, with a guy called John Craven who did it for a long time. And now it's obviously it's kept going, and it remains the BBC's staple part of their news provision for kids. Now, what is quite important about this is that whereas the BBC obviously are constantly reviewing what they're putting out, and they're looking at different forms of content, as are they running enough? Are they running enough to cater for multi-ethnic groups? Are they doing enough to cater for children? Newsround has always stayed because this is their news provision for children. And this is where they can put a 5-minute show out. It was once a day. It's now 3 times a day, and they can update the news and inform the kids on the news, kind of in that capacity. So I think it's a very vital part for the BBC as part of their licence fee and sort of provision of news content for kids.
Yeah. So if we're talking about what is the news format? What do we expect from the news bulletin of this format? So that's that second box down. So it's TV. So if you've watched it already, we can say that, well, it works to a TV schedule because it's on at 9:15, 12:10 and 4 p.m. As a news programme on TV. In terms of other like TV news conventions, it's very traditional in the sense that we've got a studio, a full news studio, presenter, TV screens with either images or VTs that are cut away to. There's a moving camera, so literally as she starts talking, the camera will push in towards the presenter. Things that you wouldn't necessarily get obviously in a radio show, but perhaps in an internet style news where the production values aren't as high, you might not necessarily get such a polished studio camera movements. You get the although you do get this in internet news, you get like the idents, like the if I was to play this with the sound off, you get the graphics and lower thirds, but you also get, maybe if I find the one right at the end, just that kind of news round ident that you get there. Yeah.
It's a really good point, and this is a question which comes up later, but everything that they do is conventionally there with the news. So you could watch the key BBC flagship shows, which would be the BBC News at 6 and the BBC News at 10, and they would have exactly the same kind of thing, but this is all being modified to suit a young audience. So the news stab at the end, the bit of music which they have, kind of just has a little bit more of a youth-friendly feel to it. The colours, if you look at the colours, can you just call up the shot of the studio?
Yeah.
So if you can see on the colours are very newsy. If you look around other news programmes, they will have that slightly cold kind of studio feel to it. But actually, kind of on this, they've got that, but there is also a hint of colour, there's a hint of brightness. You'll look at the attire, which kind of the presenter's wearing. I think the presenter's name is Hayley. She's referred to as as Christian name. We don't know what her surname is, which is unlike the news programmes which you'll watch at 6 o'clock and 10 o'clock. You get the full name. But as you can see from her attire, it's not quite as authoritative as the suit and tie which you will find on the more traditional news settings. So those kind of things are adapted to fit that young target audience, and that will answer a few of the questions which come later on in terms of what they've done conventionally.
Okay, so we've kind of already answered. Oh gosh, what's happened there? We've kind of already answered about what it is and what we expect from like a news TV program. We've said that we expect, the studio, the moving cameras, the presenters, the idents, that kind of thing. In terms
headlines, they give a brief headline at the start of the show to hook people in. To sort of almost like a little menu. This is what's coming up on the show today.
Yeah, so we've got the headlines, we've got the presenter, we've got the studio, we've got moving cameras, you've got the idents and graphics. I think that's pretty clear. In terms of what you expect from, so the question was, what do you expect from a news type, so international? Mr. Under, what would you say we expect from an international thing that we get in this?
Well, first up, I think the Newsround is traditionally it's a national news program. It's news content aimed for UK kids, so it will cover UK issues. The thing with the coronavirus story is that it's ripped apart so much, and in a way now, obviously coronavirus is an international story. So kind of Newsround traditionally would be a national story. They would lead where they possibly can with stories kind of which are centred around the UK, unless there's something kind of a Donald Trump issue or a huge international story where kind of that story overweighs the kind of stories which are happening here in the UK. So predominantly they would always aim to go with national content, and in a way they have, because obviously the coronavirus is affecting us as much here in the UK as it is to other countries around kind of around the place. But I imagine at this moment in time it does have slightly more of an international feel to it, because this is what everyone's going through.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So I think that's that box covered. The next one is about the target audience. So just defining them. Newsround and BBC themselves specifically say on their website, and you can have a look at this yourself, their age is 6 to 12. Gender, I think it obviously has to be both. Occupation, if we're talking, socioeconomics, it would need to just be school student. More specifically, primary school student. Ethnicity is, of course, because it's a predominantly national TV programme, it's just British or UK. I don't think they do different programmes for Scotland, Wales or Ireland, do they? It's just...
No. So it'll be a set UK...
Yeah, so it's a UK audience. Okay, so that's how it's defined in terms of how it appeals to them. So
can I just pick up on that? I would actually challenge. So that's obviously how it's done. Kind of having a 5-year-old now, I don't think that Darcy would have any interest in Newsround as a 6-year-old. So I actually think it's probably pitched a little bit older.
Yeah.
So kind of my interpretation of it, and sort of when we've done this in the past, is always sort of think. I think it's sort of is probably a bit more 8 to 14.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. And I agree with the gender, absolutely. Yes, it is aimed at school students. And then the secondary audience, obviously parents watching it.
Yeah.
It might be that one thing is the older you get, the more consumed by news you become, the more interesting news you become. So I can imagine at this moment in time you're thinking news. You pick and choose the news that you want. Well, actually, you become much more informed by news. And if I look to my listening habits as I've got older, I've gone from listening to Radio 1 to Radio 2, but now actually to 5 Live with quite frequency. Yeah. It probably won't be too many years before I'm switching over to Radio 4. Yeah. So your level of news, and I think that's something which we've spoken about before, Mr. Butler, isn't it? That you've noticed.
Yeah, very traditionally speaking, like I would have been much more into BBC Radio 1. And now, as I'm edging closer into my 30s, BBC Radio 2 is suddenly becoming much more interesting, and so same goes for BBC Radio 4, and talk-based programming. So it is, people do tend to follow the stereotypes in those ways.
Yeah. So the older you get, the more interesting news you become. But there's one thing: is a lot of this comes down to social class in some respects as well, and that was one of the demographics which was just asked upon that. Yeah. I suppose, obviously, kids can only be dictated by their parents, and so if you come from sort of a social background where news is important and news is on all the time, and people are consuming news and people are watching the news at 10 o'clock or at 6 o'clock every time, you're more likely to put on Newsround for your kids. Whereas actually, if your only bit of news that you're going to get is kind of in maybe lower income families, it's just someone flicking through the phone and just going, oh, a news flash coming up about we just got it now, Prince of Wales has tested positive for coronavirus. That might be their only news input a day, and they're not necessarily going to make their kids sit down and watch Newsround. Yeah. So the social class will be very much dictated from that of the parents, and through the parents' understanding and adaptability of news.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next one is, so how is the programme appealing to that audience in these ways? So if I just copy and paste those in there, what we're looking for now is the evidence of what is done to appeal to them. So we're looking at content, so like what is the news programme about, the visuals, the presentation, literally what the presenter is saying, how the language is used in that and in their script, and perhaps even their body language, or we might even think about their costume, how that has been designed, because it will be designed. They won't have just necessarily rocked up in, well, they might be, but then a costume designer might make slight adjustments. The editing of the news programme, the graphics, the music, any kind of the set design, and then the formality. So how is the news programme pitched? Is it informal? Is it formal? How is that dictated by the target audience? If we start off with age, so if we're looking, they specify 6 to 12, but also let's have a look at this 8 to 14 age bracket. What would you say, Mr. Underwood, are the things that kind of flag up to you that, okay, this is clearly for like 6 to 14-year-olds? Is there anything?
Okay, so a few notes when we've gone through. The fact she's referring to herself as Hayley, so it makes it very personable. It's almost like this lady is a teacher, kind of in some respects. So just wanting to become, pitch yourself sort of in those ways. The bright colours, obviously we've spoken about as well. The simplified language. If you're listening to the sequence where they've got the footage of Boris Johnson doing one of his briefings, they refer to. Well, he's referred to as the Prime Minister. I don't think they said Boris Johnson, but I might be wrong on that. But that doesn't matter even if they did. But the people alongside were just referred to as his scientific advisors. So there's no names given. Whereas on the BBC News at 6, they would say, I think it's Chris Whitty. They would say Chris Whitty, and they give him his full title, which would be something along the lines of science. So they're taking out any kind of information which really isn't needed. They're dumbing it down to the absolute basics for the kids to understand. They also sort of used quite in terms of language. They said, and this will be, when they're talking about the social distancing, they were talking about, and this will be quite hard for us. So the inflections that they're using, they wouldn't use that line on the news at 6 or the news at 10. this will be quite hard for us. They would say these are the measures which we have to abide by.
Yeah.
So it's pitching the same story, but in a different way to the kids to be able to understand. And kind of then, in terms of the content, they explained social distancing in really quite sort of graphic detail, didn't they, in terms of visualising it?
Yeah.
They probably wouldn't have done that quite as much on the news at 6 and 10. They would have just put up a caption saying "stay 2 meters apart from people." But
Yeah.
there they demonstrated it. They made it more visual, so they're visualising everything that they possibly can and using it in a really sort of easy to understand way. So actually, in terms of that box, the content I think we've covered. Visuals, the presentation, the way how she presents it and guides it through is very natural. It doesn't have quite the weight or authority that the newsreader at 6 or 10 would have. It's not as stern.
Okay.
The language, I think we've sort of covered, is more softer. It's more descriptive, more understandable for the young kids. Graphics.
Yeah, so graphics are, of course, it's like it's colour scheme. Each news programme you tend to watch will have a easily identifiable, recognisable colour scheme. So when you think of BBC News, everyone thinks of red. When you think of Newsround, it is, and it has been for quite some time, this, I don't know how to describe it, this kind of, it's a mix of blue and purple, which is easily recognisable. It's really kind of gender specific, although if you really want to stereotype, you could say that the blue is for male, and then the pink and purple is for female, which is very easily identifiable for a young audience. The music is, I've found it quite strange in the sense that when they're talking about Boris Johnson, I don't know if you can hear it underneath this part of the bulletin here, when it cuts away to one of his briefings, there's almost, I found it quite jarring that the music is very childish, as Newsround needs to be.
Yeah, I felt it was the wrong choice of music, to be honest, in terms of that. But they've put it in there to just soften and to inject that pace, a little bit of pace. And when you listen to the Heart Bulletin, it's got a lot of rhythmic music throughout, and that's to sort of keep the momentum of it going. I think you're right. I think that it's good they've included music, but it just didn't seem the right thing. Yeah. But equally, you would not get a bed used on the BBC News at 6 or at 10, and those are the things. Those are the two shows I would just compare this to, kind of throughout, because that just wouldn't happen.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I think we've covered age pretty well in terms of gender. We did mention perhaps about the colour scheme of the studio and idents. For idents are sometimes, I keep saying idents. Idents can sometimes be called stabs. It's the the intro and the outro to a program, just like a graphic thing, like we've got there. So again, we've got the colour scheme there. I think.
Also, just on gender, they do have two presenters, don't they? So we've got Haley on this one, and then there's a lad who does it kind of as alternate bulletins. He actually features in one of the reports. So I think just by having kind of both a male and female presenter, kind of that's another thing to just think that ticks both boxes. If, like my daughter, she only listens to girls and princesses.
I think we've kind of already covered, like, through occupation being a school student and ethnicity being a UK, perhaps more British audience. That's kind of already, I think we've covered that when talking about the age. It's the way it's pitched to a young person, but in terms of socioeconomics, occupation, it is very much the way it is pitched to just a younger person. Ethnicity. The BBC have a remit to service the entire UK, However, through I think that reporting, we are getting a more British regionality. Through the presenters, through the language, through the dialect of the presenters. Where I think in Newsround, I don't very often see, or hear, sorry, a Welsh accent, a Scottish accent, a Northern Irish accent. It's very much mostly British.
Yeah, one thing which I think the BBC have had to do over recent years, and this is across all programming, is bring in and include more northern voices and more kind of regional voices, and they've done that quite a lot. Sort of, if I think back to Radio 1 when I was listening to it, you didn't have such a range of people from across the whole country. That's actually that has changed a bit now, but I think within news there is still very much the RP delivery. They want that sort of pronounced delivery of the news. Very much speaking the Queen's English. You wouldn't get someone on with a bit, with a really
Geordie accent,
Yorkshire or Manc accent to do this, because it is still received pronunciation they want to hear. That's RP, and that hasn't really come in. You might find it a little bit. They had that girl from Leeds who does BBC Breakfast News, and she's got a very heavy Yorkshire accent. So they are kind of doing it a little bit more. But I think that is certainly something which you won't find too much on formal news broadcasts.
Yeah.
The BBC obviously being a very formal service.
Okay. So I think we've covered how the target audiences appeal to. The next one is, why do you feel the news producers selected the stories they did in order to appeal to the demographics of the audience? Is it out of public interest? Is it because it's dramatic? Does it create a narrative? Does it spark debate, novelty, humour? Is it through a geographic location, or is it just culturally relevant? So the news stories that we had were obviously the coronavirus main headline. We then had that kind of special report on what is social distancing. Then we got we got the story about the prosthetic arm that was Star Wars themed. And then we got the light-hearted bit at the end of the penguins being allowed to roam around the zoo whilst the zoo was closed to the public. So, why do we think that they were selected in that way? Do you think?
Right. Well, obviously, coronavirus at this moment in time is it is the big thing, and you won't find a news bulletin, I believe, probably not leading with that at this moment in time, and most of them will actually. The sport is now pretty much coronavirus led in terms of what is being cancelled and everything. Newsround's a bit of an exception there in the fact of they did have they had a story, particularly the one with the prosthetic arm, which wasn't linked to the coronavirus in any way, but it probably was also included. Because obviously there's now a restriction on reporters going out and reporting local stories or local kind of news stories elsewhere, that was probably, I sort of think, internet footage that they gathered to create a story. So it's probably a story which has been filmed by a news crew out in New York and just shared across the world as an alternative story. It's probably not necessarily sourced by the Newsround crew. So that is a restriction which people are finding at this moment in time. There was no reporter involved in any of the other news clips, which you would traditionally see. That is a convention of news broadcasting, is the reporter on location interviewing people and doing that. And that was more like news footage which they'd gathered. Obviously, at this moment in time, the coronavirus is just purely of the public interest.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing narrative. It's changing pretty much. At times, it felt last week in particular, it's changing like hour by hour. And people want news to be informed.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they want to be led by what's going on. And at this moment in time, I know we're kind of, when we were in school last week, we were on BBC News all the time, just hitting refresh, kind of because we wanted to be informed in terms of what's going on. So it's public interest, and it's just creating the story which goes on and on and on regarding coronavirus. And although that might not be of absolute interest to the target audience, it obviously affects them, because they're the ones who are now having to be homeschooled. They're the ones who are really having to sort of adapt to this new change in the way how they've sort of gone about their lives, and as you guys have, kind of all you've ever known is this school structure of 3 terms sort of in school, and now the whole education cycle has has changed. So they're very much involved with that, and that's why they're being informed of those of those stories and of those changes to their lives and what they can do.
In terms of the prosthetic arm, would you say that that's like some novelty, a little bit of humour to lighten the load, so that the news report isn't completely all about the virus?
And that to me is really important for Newsround, because kids obviously don't have, or the young kids, so the BBC pitching this age, and maybe this is why the argument of 6 to 12 is a bit more accurate. But, I know from just trying to homeschool my daughter in the last couple of days, the attention span is quite hard to engage. So actually, by having in those alternate stories, they're almost just like the Finally stories, aren't they, which you get on news bulletins, and that's another convention of most news. You get the Finally story, the story which is the light-hearted ramp at the end. They've given you doom and gloom with the current with the top stories, and then all of a sudden they try to just ramp it up, pick it back up again. Don't forget, we're talking to young kids, and they want to be entertained more than being informed. And that's probably quite an interesting sort of thing to think about. The other 2 news bulletins which we look at will be people probably who have a little, certainly the last one, you're going out, the internet one, the social media one, you're going out and you are choosing actively to go onto that app and find out about the news. Whereas on this, the kids are probably, they finish watching something on CBBC and the next programme's rolling on its Newsround, so they're not choosing to do it, so they're wanting to be entertained more than being informed. And it's packaging that information in an entertaining way.
And that definitely goes with the penguins. I mean, that is still linked to coronavirus. The penguins are roaming around the zoo because coronavirus has shut down the zoo to the public. It just puts such a more positive light on the issue, and I think you'll be seeing that if you were to watch more Newsround reports or any kind of like online journalism at the moment. It's not just trying to find the negatives, it's trying to balance out the doom and gloom. Finding the funny aspects of it. A lot of online journalism, for instance, was yesterday or the day before just reporting about McDonald's shutting down, and people were just scammering for their last Big Mac. And that is, people don't all want to just focus on the numbers and the deaths and the cases of the virus, and instead want to hear about the positives of it too.
And I bet you if you were to go and ask a kid between the ages of 6 and 14 what they remembered about that bulletin, the chances are they would say the penguins wandering around the empty shopping centre, because that is why they include that. It's just that point of, okay, but why were they wandering around the shopping centre? Well, it's shut down. Why is it shut down? Because of coronavirus. So, absolutely important that those stories are included for that kind of bulletin. Would you find it on the BBC News at 6 or 10? No, but for this it works.
Okay, right. So the next one is hierarchy of information, like the news agenda. So this is like, why are the news stories ordered in the way that they were? I think we've kind of already discussed a little bit about that. It is just the importance of the day, the importance of the public interest. Whilst, yes, Newsround has got to be appealing to the younger target audience, they can't lead with the penguin story because it simply isn't as important as the the social distancing and what Boris is unveiling in his daily press briefings. So I think the news agenda, the order of the stories, is simply you know, the most important story has to come first, right?
Yeah, sometimes this will be different. Obviously, they would look for location sometimes first. So if there was an incident, and you'll find this bit more on the local news. So when we listen to a regional news bulletin, which will be the heart one, they will lead a lot more with cases of this has happened in the West Midlands or unemployment in the West Midlands is up. That will be the story that they lead with because they're putting the local story, the story which is important to the people in that region, at the top. But obviously, in a national bulletin, it's more getting out the big story of the day, and the it's an important story that they're leading, that they're leading with. You'll see on the PowerPoint how the hierarchy news is often it's like an inverted triangle, so it's like a triangle upside down. And if you have a triangle upside down, you've got the big part at the top. And if you draw lines in it, every story that you put in that triangle, in each of those lines, should get smaller and less appealing to the under the importance. So that's how you would plan a news bulletin. Most important at the top, and then you're putting sort of the lesser stories down the bottom.
Okay. Why do you believe the news is structured in this way in order to appeal to the demographics? I don't think it is necessarily about appealing to the demographics. I think it's almost just an editorial, what's the word? Professional code, I suppose. Like in news, you do, particularly in a news program, TV news program, the most important story, international important story, just has to come first. Would you say?
Yeah. Obviously, in Newsround, if there was something, and this is where it's just good to look at another couple of editions because they might cover a story which appeals to kids more in non-coronavirus times. So if there was a thing whereas I'm just trying to think, Jamie Oliver's done something new for school dinners. Okay, that might lead a news bulletin on a day when news is a little bit lighter. It might not even then feature in a news bulletin on another platform. So sometimes they will structure a bulletin with the audience in mind, but at these times, coronavirus is the only talking point. It is the only news story around. Everything is linked to coronavirus. So, kind of in terms of this, it's the editorial decision. We'll talk on this unit about the gatekeeper of news. The gatekeeper of news is the news editor. That's the person who picks the stories and puts them in that order. And previously, we've gone through these bulletins and gone, I might have moved that one to the top, or I might not have put that one in. And we previously had a conversation about the Michael Jackson child abuse claims, whether that was right to be included in a Newsround programme. And some of the kids thought, no, it's not important. Whereas others actually thought, well, it is, as long as it's packaged and described in the right way. So those are the kind of decisions which need to be kind of made by the person. But I personally, from looking at that bulletin, I think every story's been placed in the right way.
Okay, can you identify any ethical considerations that they've had to consider? How well do you believe the producers dealt with these issues? So this is like bias, slander, and libel. So just to clarify again, bias is making sure that, for instance, any political news story is balanced. What's the difference between slander and libel, sir?
Okay, so it's more kind of in slander and libel. It's libel when it's on the radio and it's broadcast, and it's slander when it's on the TV. It's slander when it's in print. So they kind of mean many of the same things. It's basically about shaming or saying something which isn't true. So, for instance, if you were to go on the news and say Michael Jackson was guilty of this without any kind of backup, you're just literally picking a name out the hat and putting sort of an allegation against them. That's slander, or that's libel. We've spoken in class, and it's actually on the PowerPoint, of how the singer Cliff Richard, obviously a very well respected singer of many, many years, kind of people of my mum's sort of generation love Cliff, and he had a child abuse story levelled against him, about 3 or 4 years ago. It might be slightly longer now, and they named him without any kind of evidence, and he took them all to court and won. Nothing was found sort of kind of guilty. So it's just making sure that your stories are 100% accurate. And now even you can post a tweet and still get caught out for libel. By putting something in a tweet which isn't true. That was the incident with Ryan Giggs, the footballer, a few years back. When, if I remember rightly, it was sort of an allegation that I think he slept with his brother's wife, and that was the story connected to that. I think that's right. It's just that's one to Google. So there's lots of cases of that in the past, but that's the basic thing of that. Just making sure that your news is accurate.
Yeah. So I don't really think there's a lot in this particular report, this news program where bias, slander, and libel would be a really significant issue. I mean, the thing with the coronavirus. What the government is advising, social distancing, everything like that. It is very much an unbiased issue. It's a bipartisan issue. It's affecting the globe, in a very general way. I suppose that when they report on what Boris Johnson is saying, a biased news report might perhaps make an off comment on Boris and the way Boris is handling the issue, but it is very much just specifically on what is being said, on how the public should deal with it. News programming at the moment is almost having to support the government in its instructions and in its relaying of the scientific advice.
It's a good point you made there, because someone like Piers Morgan might put in his own bias when he's talking about it on Good Morning Britain. Yeah. That might just be something which you reference. So Boris Johnson has made the decision, and so as we do this at this moment in time, they've obviously now put these real strict measures on, but yet builders can still go out and work. And I think he was challenging that today. So that might just be the kind of thing where people are putting in their bit more of an opinion on, or casting their thing on. Channel 4 News is also quite good at just very subtly, very cleverly, just getting across their kind of their news agenda a little bit more. Kind of at times. That might just be something to put in. Obviously, the BBC is a little bit more kind of in line with the government and with the with the Queen and the authorities of this country. So they probably play it a little bit more safely with those. Yeah. And obviously, if you could compare it to print journalism, you're obviously, if you're a newspaper, you're obviously sided with Rupert Murdoch's very Tory rightism news slant, or you go, if Guardian, Observers, are papers which go the other way and they challenge that kind of rhetoric and that agenda with some of the content that they put out of. So you do see it a little bit more in print than what you do on kind of in visual. I just got a couple of ethical things that the Gate Reviews, the news editor, would have thought down. So these are two just things which actually, if I was working on the news that day, what would I have thought about? Scaremongering. We're obviously at a time where there's fake news. So I would have just made sure that any young kids watching this, and obviously the target audience is 6, that's what they're aiming for. So is there anything in that which would make a 6-year-old panic and be really scared kind of about what's going on? Anything that, is making something so much more sensational than what it is. Okay, so that would have been something which I would have thought about. And then also, I'm not too sure how they referred to the kid with the prosthetic arm, but just referring to it, and a lot of kids are referred to on news bulletins by just a Christian name. And they might say the age, but they won't say. I think they said that she was from Florida, but no more. They do that to protect kids. If they're giving out full names of kids, if we know it's, so for instance, Charlie Bates, who's a 15-year-old who lives in Solihull, it'll be much easier to find Charlie rather than just referring to him. Charlie's a 15-year-old student from the West Midlands. So the way of how reporting kids is something which is really important and needs to be done. And I didn't quite pick up if they referred to her to her surname as well.
Yeah.
Kind of
No, I don't think they did.
I'd be surprised if they did. But those are the two things which I would just be thinking for that particular bulletin in terms of what we're thinking about.
Okay. We've got 2 more boxes, and then I think we're done for this video. So the next one is, how does the news producer and product as a whole impact how the audience interprets the story? So we're talking there about bias and balance, and what this product is. This is about knowing and researching and finding out a little bit more about who owns this product, who is the producer, or who are the producers here, and how does that impact how the audience might interpret the story. So you've got to remember here that, again, the BBC, CBBC, Newsround are there to service the public. We as adults have to pay the TV licence, and as part of their remit, they have to educate, inform, but also a little bit entertain the public whilst conveying this information. So I think we've already kind of discussed it, but it's how Newsround cater very, very important and difficult stories for a younger audience, to make sure that whilst they are entertained, they are still educated. So like Mr. Underwood said, for instance, his daughter, might not necessarily really enjoy that first story, but what might make them grasp coronavirus, and a young person grasp coronavirus, is the penguins being able to roam around the zoo. The gravity of the story is grasped through that entertaining bit of information. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of what they go away with thinking, and obviously that was a really good point about the BBC. We pay the licence fee. They are a public service broadcaster. The other 2 bulletins that you hear aren't from public service broadcasting, so the rules are a little bit different. But the BBC have to adhere by certain codes.
Yeah.
They have to obviously turn around. And what was very interesting last week was how the BBC announced how they were going to get through this period. So it might just be worth Googling, just sort of reflecting. I know that they're putting on more educational programs. So they're going to be doing more. So I think BBC Two is going to become like an educational platform for them, where they're putting on endless educational programs to suit that need. They're doing a lot more news programs, so things like the One Show, and going to become literally coronavirus broadcasts. They're doing a lot more kind of Q&As on BBC Radio with audience, people phoning in. And actually, if you listen to BBC Radio 5 Live, they do that sort of like almost every 2 hours. They're doing like a phone in with people asking their questions, because everyone's affected in so many different ways, and by getting experts on. So they are trying to adapt to that kind of as an organisation. And Newsround is the way of how they can possibly just package this towards the younger demographic.
The issue of coronavirus in a way that educates and informs younger target audience. Okay, and then the last one. So this is, what messages are the producers trying to mediate, and how does the format, style, and practice impact this? So mediate, if you remember from like Unit 1, media representations, mediate is, what are the messages hidden inside the product? So for instance, like we talk about preferred, oppositional, negotiated meanings in media products. So like, remember, the preferred of a Mackey's advert is that an audience will go away and buy a McDonald's, whereas an oppositional audience would protest outside and never buy a Mackey's product. With this, again, it's in news reports that are allowed to be a little bit more biased and a little bit less balanced, like certain publish-based news things like newspapers, or Channel 5 News and Sky News, that is owned by the a corporation, have more specific political messages in their reports. However, BBC is meant to be more balanced. You know, so that's the only kind of message that you can say I think is mediated in this, is that it is trying to be balanced. It's trying to be unbiased. You don't get a very obvious political interpretation of any of the stories, like for instance in ITV and Good Morning Britain and Piers Morgan being a little bit more sensational, a little bit more biased. You know, Sky News, for instance, of course, won't have to adhere to the BBC codes of practice about being balanced and about being unbiased. So for this one, I don't really think there is anything subliminal underneath. Would you say, Mr. Underwood, it is just balanced? It is.
No, I agree. Yeah, completely. Don't forget, Newsround is for kids. It's wholesome. There won't be any kind of hidden agenda. It's the presenters are kind of. There's nothing in there where they even have a mouthpiece to even sort of contribute any of their thoughts. And I don't think there's any kind of hidden message in that, apart from the message, which is we need to stay safe and
and to maybe not panic. The idea of ending on the prosthetic arm and then the penguins running around the zoo. The message here is for young people to, be informed, be educated, but not latch onto the scaremongering, and actually remember there are some light-hearted aspects of this.
And life goes on as well. Kind of even amongst this, life is going on, which in the other news bulletins, and I'll keep on referring back because you need to sort of draw these comparisons, there won't be very much that message of, we will get beyond this, don't worry, it'll be very matter of fact. This has to have a little bit more of a positive outlook.
Okay.
Can I just make one more point actually, which I didn't do earlier?
Yeah.
This will probably fit under the content section.
Sure.
Okay, so just on the prosthetic arm, they included Mark Hamill from the Star Wars.
Yes, yeah.
And that was quite interesting. Why did they use him? Well, obviously connected to Star Wars, so that link was there. But celebrity is really important, but particularly familiar faces to young people. They really work and they really connect. Just being at home with Darcy this week, I see how she. So when we put on Joe Wicks, she does not know who Joe Wicks is. The workout that he's doing.
Quite. He's making a killing out of this. People are loving it.
She was not bothered about it in the slightest. But when I put on Oti from Strictly doing her dance class at 11 o'clock, absolutely got in and bought into it. So celebrity, just the inclusion of a celebrity from a film which will be adored by the audience of 6 to 12-year-olds or 8 to 14-year-olds, Mark Hamill will be a very recognised name or character, and so that would have just given it that little bit more of appeal to the audience. They wouldn't have necessarily brought in a celebrity on a news bulletin pitched at an older person. I think where possible, it's always quite good to get a view where people can go, if that's what Bob Geldof thinks, I've got to agree with it, or if that's who so and so thinks. So they will do where possible, but it would be done in a more kind of formal, getting a news bite. When someone makes a comment. So I just thought the inclusion of that is worth referencing, and it just made that story just stand out even more, probably in the mind of in the mind of the person who's watching it.
Yeah, it does. It definitely does. Right, okay. I think that's our talk through of case study 1. Should we leave it there?
Yeah, let's leave it there.
Okay, right.